and just explain to us how you came to be writing about character, Stoicism, and having this expert view on all things Stoic.
Well, thank you. I don't know about an expert, but I'm trying. I got into Stoicism simply because at some point, like a lot of people, I went through a midlife crisis, and I needed some resources to deal with that crisis. Nothing out of the ordinary. My father died after a long illness, and I was hit by a sudden divorce that I was not expecting, that sort of stuff. Now, I figured that philosophy might be a place to look for resources when adversity strikes, because there really are not that many options. You either go religious or you go philosophical. And since I was done with being religious since my teenage years, I grew up Catholic, but then I left the church. Then I figured, okay, let's look at philosophy. And so I started taking a look at what is called practical philosophy, or philosophy as a way of life. And there are a number of examples. You can look at Buddhism, you can read about Aristotle, you can familiarize yourself with Epicurus. And all of those were very interesting. I did all of that, but none of them really clicked. And then at one point, I rediscovered really Stoicism, because I read some of the Stoics when I was much younger, but I rediscovered Stoicism, particularly a guy named Epictetus, who was an early 2nd century Stoic. He started out his life literally at the bottom of the societal rank. He was a slave, and then eventually he was freed, and he established his own school and became one of the most sought after teachers in the entire Mediterranean area. And Epictetus immediately spoke to me. It was like one of those things like, okay, this guy makes sense. He's speaking plainly and clearly. He has a sense of humor bordering on sarcasm, which I appreciated. And so I was hooked. And once I got to Stoicism through Epictetus, then, of course, little by little, I sort of started reading all the other ones, Marcus Aurelius and his meditations. Seneca is arguably the most important Stoic writer, certainly the one from whom we have the most extant writings. And so, years passed, and here we are.
So could you just tell us a little bit about Quest for Character?
Yeah, The Quest for Character, which in the UK, I think is published as How to Be Good. I don't know why publishers changed the titles of the books and their covers, but whatever, that's their business. Started out because I was actually interested in a particular story, which gives the subtitle to the book, the story of Socrates and Alcibiades. So Socrates, of course, needs no introduction, arguably the most famous philosopher of all time in the Western tradition. However, Alcibiades is one of those characters that are so fascinating and yet not well known. And I still wonder why nobody's actually made a movie out of his life.
Yeah.
I mean, this guy was incredible, right? He was impossibly handsome, uber rich, very brave, dashing kind of character. This was like very ambitious.
And a sportsman as well, wasn't he?
Exactly, yes. He won chariot races at the Olympics. I mean, it's like the guy was all over the place. And he also happened to be a friend and student of Socrates. And that's where the story begins to be interesting, because what happened was that a very, very young Alcibiades goes to Socrates and says, I think I have all it takes to be a leader in Athens. I want to be a statesman. This guy was in his early 20s, right? So ambitious. But I realized that, I might use some advice here. And so I come to you, my mentor, for some advice. And Socrates basically sets him down and gives him what we would today call a job interview, and starts saying, so, okay, let's talk about what would you do? How would you approach problems and issues in the city? And it becomes very clear during the dialogue that Alcibiades is not really interested in improving the city or making it a better place or anything. He's interested in self-aggrandizing. He's a narcissist, right? And so at some point, Socrates says, you really shouldn't do this. In fact, I'm going to quote this striking passage. This is from the Alcibiades Maior, which is a dialogue attributed to Plato. And Socrates says, then alas, Alcibiades, what a condition you suffer from. I hesitate to name it, but since we two are alone, it must be said. You are wedded to stupidity, best of men, of the extreme sort, as the argument accuses you and you accuse yourself. So this is why you are leaping into the affairs of the city before you have been educated. It's like, holy crap, this is really harsh on the part of Socrates, right? It's like you suffer from stupidity, best of men. Now, the word there that is often translated as stupidity is amatia, which in Greek actually means something closer to unwisdom. So what Socrates is saying is that Alcibiades can have all of the other stuff that normally people, are impressed by, looks and wealth and all that sort of stuff. But he's missing the important thing, the most important thing though. He's missing a good character. He's a narcissist. He's not really into helping other people, and so he really shouldn't get into politics. Now, unfortunately, Alcibiades does not follow Socrates' advice, and sure enough, it becomes a disaster. I mean, Alcibiades arguably was half responsible for the disaster that was the Peloponnesian War for Athens. So this is an extraordinary story. And when I started reading about this, not only I was fascinated by the life and character of Alcibiades, but I thought, isn't that interesting that Socrates is now in the business of advising people, essentially giving career advice to people, whether to do or not do certain things, particularly into politics. And it turns out, when I looked into it a little bit more in detail, that there are several other places where Socrates does that. A lot of the times we think of Socrates as it emerges from the Platonic dialogues, because Plato is the major source that we have about Socrates. But there are others. And one of the other major sources is a book by a guy named Xenophon. And the title of the book is the Memorabilia. And it's really a story of Socrates. And Xenophon, like Plato, was a student of Socrates. But unlike Plato, Xenophon was not a philosopher. He was a general. And so he really wasn't interested that much in the philosophy. He was interested in the politics. He was interested in practical advice that Socrates was going to give. And so Xenophon tells us of several instances where Socrates advises people either to get into politics or not to get into politics. And when people follow his advice, things actually go well. So there's one case, there's one case of Glaucon, for instance, who was Plato's brother. Clearly not a good fit for politics, for statesmanship. Socrates tells him so, and Glaucon actually, unlike Alcibiades, Glaucon actually follows Socrates' advice, becomes a musician, and everything is fine. On the other hand, Charmides, who was Glaucon's own son, was not into going into politics. He didn't want to get into politics. He was shy. But Socrates thought that this guy really had what it takes in terms of character, and so he actually said, you really should get into politics. You really should try to be helpful to the city. And in fact, Charmides does. And unfortunately, he does under very dire circumstances for Athens, because by that point, the city had lost the Peloponnesian War. But nevertheless, he does his best. So it turns out that what emerges is this figure of Socrates, not the gadfly that asks, embarrassing questions to powerful people, as we get in Plato, but the person actually gives advice on career, and particularly in politics. And so he influences the politics of the city, essentially by going around and telling people, yeah, you should do it, or no, you shouldn't do it.